Welcome back to From the Region with Richard Giragosian. This week's program, in a series of our weekly analytical presentations, will deal with national security and foreign policy. Marking the 10th anniversary of September 11th, 2001, the attacks on the United States, which actually prompted the subsequent war on terrorism. In many ways, this is the 10th anniversary of 9/11. And 9/11 in many ways reshaped the geopolitical map, both globally and of the region. It also came to affect U.S. policy regarding Armenia and Azerbaijan in particular. But let's look at 9/11 first of all, and let's look at the war on terrorism. What this meant for U.S. policy was a new preference for stability and security around the world instead of democracy promotion per se. What this meant for Azerbaijan was the United States military needed Azerbaijan after 9/11 much more than before. It was no longer just an energy-producing nation for the United States, but a key transit hub for U.S. military transport routes into the theater of Afghanistan. And in many ways, Azerbaijan acquired greater strategic significance for the U.S. military in the post-9/11 context. Interestingly for Armenia, however, after 9/11, Armenia was able to emerge as much more of a contributor rather than a consumer of international security. Armenian military peacekeepers, having been deployed and serving with distinction in Kosovo, Iraq, and Afghanistan, made Armenia, and very small Armenia, a very large contributor to regional and global security. This was very important in terms of demonstrating Armenia's value, both in terms of stability and security. And in many ways, U.S. policy shifted to be much less demanding for calling to account the Armenian and the Azerbaijani government's performance in democratic reform. And in many ways, the United States tended to look the other way for problems and shortcomings in elections in both countries. But when we look over this preference of stability rather than democracy, it unfortunately led the Armenian and the Azerbaijani governments at the time to get away with too much and to do too little in terms of greater democratic performance and cleaner and fairer elections. But in many ways, when we look at national security, we see that a key component of national security of Armenia is being overlooked and is not being sufficiently addressed. What I'm talking about is disaster preparation in particular. One of the lessons from Japan, for example, in recent years was how the Japanese government failed to address nuclear safety and failed to contain the damage of a very tragic nuclear accident in the wake of a tsunami that hit Japan. Armenia, which has the only nuclear power plant in the region, must take more concrete steps to prepare for a potential disaster or accident at the Medzamor nuclear facility. The Medzamor facility is a very old power plant, one of the oldest in operation today. It's also based on an outdated Soviet design reactor, which inherently is dangerous and threatening. While the Medzamor nuclear facility is essential for Armenia's energy needs, especially given the blockade of Armenia both by Azerbaijan and Turkey, the Armenian government needs to take more resolute and clearer steps to guarantee the safety and the adequate performance of the Medzamor facility. Additionally, not enough attention is being prepared or devoted to preventing another earthquake in Armenia. Now, an earthquake is a natural disaster. Like every other natural disaster, no country is able to fully prevent either an earthquake or a similar natural disaster. But in the Armenian context, having learned and suffered from a very tragic, devastating earthquake in its recent past, Armenia should take steps now to prepare for the potential of tomorrow, to prepare for a possible second earthquake. There is no real evacuation plan. There is little in effect in terms of containing and managing the effect and the impact from a disaster. Taking the two issues together, the safety and the operations of the nuclear power plant in the wake of a threat of an earthquake is especially important. In other words, the threat of an earthquake is one disaster to prepare for. The threat of an accident at the nuclear power plant triggered by an earthquake doubles the damage and should necessitate even more concrete steps. And in terms of national security, this reveals that not enough is being devoted to adequately protecting the Armenian country and population. But let's look at a related aspect of both 9/11 and national security: Armenian foreign policy. In most countries, foreign policy is used to project and to protect national interests. Foreign policy in Armenia, however, has generally been far too reactive rather than dynamic or proactive. In a country like Armenia, similar to Israel in the sense of being surrounded by hostile or enemy nations, being very small in both geography and population, Armenian foreign policy must be innovative, creative, and must be able to exploit opportunities when they arise. To date, however, Armenian foreign policy has largely been driven by the need to react to either developments regarding Nagorno-Karabakh or developments regarding Turkey and Azerbaijan. There's not enough room for flexibility and innovation within the parameters of Armenia's foreign policy. Two concrete examples here. One is Iran. Armenia has a very close relationship and solid relationship with the Islamic Republic of Iran. At the same time, Armenia is the only country in the region that can actually help and advise the European Union, even the Russian Federation, on how to devise a policy of engagement with Iran. This is especially important because Armenia is well positioned to exploit its potential role as a bridge or a mediator with Iran and the West. What this also means, more recently, for example, is Armenia needs to play a greater role where it has distinct advantages. For example, Armenian diasporan populations not only in Iran or Lebanon, but most notably in Syria, offer the Armenian government and the Armenian Foreign Ministry to play a leading role in mediating and brokering what happens in Syria. For example, Turkey has emerged as a key mediating country in terms of dealing with the Syrian government and the Syrian opposition. But why not Armenia? In fact, Turkey should be the last country to be mediating with Syria, with whom Turkey has had territorial disputes. From Ottoman history, several prominent problems in their relations. Turkey should not be the one country to be mediating Syria. In effect, Armenia needs to play a greater role and needs to exploit these missed opportunities, with Syria being the most recent. But when we look at national security and shortcomings in Armenian foreign policy, it also reveals the bigger challenge or the bigger problem for the Republic of Armenia. And that problem is internal, is domestic in nature. More specifically, there is in political science a wide distance between ruling a country and governing a country. In Armenia's case, governments in Armenia, from Ter-Petrosyan through former President Kocharyan to current President Serge Sargsyan, these have been governments largely ruling the country and not really governing the country. Governance infers and implies consensus, compromise in politics, and building legitimacy, internal strength. In our case, in the Republic of Armenia, there's been a shortfall or a deficit of leadership. We've had many government officials, but very few government statesmen. And there is a devoid and a deficiency here. But at the same time, we also see a problem of national power. A country's national power is generally defined by geography, resources, and demography. In Armenia's case, demographically, Armenia is now weak. Geographically, Armenia is small and is continuing to be isolated. In terms of resources, the most important natural resource of Armenia is actually human capital. It's the Armenian population themselves. but after years of a brain drain, an exodus of the best and the brightest from Armenia, we need to address problems of internal weakness and fragility, as well as vulnerability. Part of the key to building national power is economic strength, not just military and not just political, but what we need is not only greater democratic credentials which are important for real legitimacy, but we need more concrete economic development based on the needs of the people, not based on the desires of the few. Because in Armenia, we see a political and, most importantly, economic elite comprising only 5% of the population, which controls most of Armenia's wealth and resources. This is the key impediment to economic development, growth, and national power. And this needs to be addressed in tackling the most obvious and most unacceptable definition of politics in Armenia. And that is, most governments of Armenia have been ruling the country based not on national interest, but by self-interest. And for too long, Armenian officials have been allowed to run the country based on their own self-interest over and instead of national interest. This is an issue and an area where both the Armenian population and the Armenian diaspora needs to actually become more engaged and more active in calling to account the Armenian government and calling to account and demanding more change from the Armenian officials, both the political and economic elite. In this context, we talk a lot about so-called oligarchs, leading businessmen that are now in politics. This is actually, like corruption, the cancer of the Armenian society. And until we treat the disease and not the symptoms, there is little hope for Armenia to advance. And that is why the coming election cycle is a true test and a threshold of transition for Armenia. No longer can we afford to look the other way in shortcomings in democratic performance or in deficiencies in economic development. The future of Armenia is at stake now. What kind of Armenia we're building today will affect generations to come. In fact, even more fundamentally, decisions taken today will not only affect generations to come, but will really mean whether there is a Republic of Armenia in the future. Independence and sovereignty are now at stake. And in fact, this coming election cycle marks an important and significant threshold for the kind of Armenia we will have in the future, and whether we will maintain an independent, stronger Republic of Armenia in the future. Thank you for watching, and until next time, this is From the Region with Richard Giragosian.